Okay, guys, we are all live here with David Burkus, who is organization psychologist and author of 4 best-selling books, including the latest one, Leading from Anywhere, which is the core of this conversation. Now, I have to admit, I have never ever led team remotely myself, and I consider it as a strength because I'm like that manager, David, that a year ago we all were forced almost into going to this remote leadership without no experience, and we had to all figure it out. Now I don't lead a team, so I'm almost in the same position that most of the managers found themselves globally in the same position. And I'm wondering, how well have we adapted within that year?
Yeah, well, I mean, it depends on a couple things, right? I think a lot of I mean, we've had almost a year to do it. It's amazing to me. I remember, here in the United States, March 14th, 15th or so was the kind of the beginning of the end of the world, right? And here we use this term 15 days to slow the spread. And then a couple days into that, it became 30 and then 45. And then we stopped counting because had you told someone on March 15th that we would be on, I don't know, I think it's day 357 or something like that at this point, they probably wouldn't have believed you. And so I think we did okay given the circumstances. I think a lot of managers went into it, a lot of team leaders went into it thinking this would be a temporary kind of 2-week thing. So we don't need to make a lot of investments in the tech that keeps people connected, and we don't need to change a lot about how we do business. And then, of course, by mid-April, there was the realization that, no, we do need to change a lot. And a lot of people were actually finding at that point that remote workers were actually more productive, right? The ones that weren't being asked to be on endless Zoom calls, et cetera. But that led to sort of the summer of burnout. And the research actually, even before the pandemic about remote workers is really clear on this. That tends to happen. People, when they first start working from home or working from somewhere other than the office, they tend to start work when they would normally start their commute. They tend to end work when they would normally have arrived home. They tend to do I didn't have a bigger struggle blurring the line between work and life. And those are all things, to be honest with you, that we didn't teach managers to help out with right away. We were just focused on how do we get tasks done? How do we stay as productive away from the office as we were in? And the second half of this year-long, maybe a little longer than a year experiment has been learning all of those things, right? In particular, learning how we can help our people set some boundaries so they have time away from work, so they don't feel like they're living at work instead of working from home. And then the other thing has been really trying to pay attention more recently into how do we build bonds and a sense of connection. I mean, you can end up feeling like you're not actually part of a team when you're working from home too long. You're just communicating with a bunch of people. They're almost like non-playable characters in a video game, right? You send your message off to them and then you wait for their reply and then you get it back, but you don't really feel like they're a person anymore. And so this is where we are right now, where a lot of the good leaders and good managers are asking, how do I do that part? How do I make the team feel like a team again? That's something I don't think anybody really counted on having to do, but here we are. And as I said, the good managers are doing a pretty good job on that. Now, that said, there are a lot of people that are continuing to burn out their people by just assuming that how responsive they are and how often they're on Zoom meetings is a good proxy for their productivity. And that needs to change. But there will always be bad managers to fight in some capacity, right? So, there's that.
So how do we measure that productivity? Because ahead of this episode, and right as you said, the end of the world started. What do we do now? I tried to imagine myself if I was a leader of a team now, I would do certain things. And one of the questions was actually, how would I measure the productivity? Like over the years, I've learned to measure it even just from watching and observing. You've got this ability and this opportunity to see and to assess yourself even without asking, and then you can ask and to explore it further. Now I can't see it. So how do we measure that?
Yeah, so to be fair, even before the great work from home experiment, there were a lot of problems measuring productivity, right? I mean, most or large organizations were doing performance reviews, for example, on an annual basis, which is not, I mean, you're the feedback coach. That is not an appropriate interval of time to be giving feedback that actually improves performance. And then a lot of that was based on observable behaviors, which is fine, right? We give people feedback on observable behaviors so that they can get better at what they're doing. But that's still not a focus on the actual outcome. That's still a focus on activity. And what that led to was when we went into this, well, I can't see them every day, so I can't observe those behaviors. we started using easy proxies like responsiveness, right? How active are you in our Slack channel? How quickly do you respond to emails? How participatory in a Zoom call are you? As opposed to really focusing on outcomes. Now, the smart leaders have done that. They've taken whatever our team's projects are and broken them up into much smaller intervals of time and much smaller goals, a week to 2 weeks, right? And then developed it. A lot of people stole, it's actually really interesting, even as Scrum kind of has gotten away from these daily questions, a lot of remote leaders stole the same questions from the daily stand-up of the Agile movement, which is basically putting a system in place where people are regularly sharing, okay, what did I just finish? What am I focused on now? And where do I need help, or what's blocking my progress? And so when you shrink those timelines down, not only do you provide smaller wins, which is fantastic, but you also make it easier to see who's consistently hitting their weekly or biweekly expectations and who's not. And that's an outcome-based measure of productivity, as opposed to just observing behaviors that we believe will lead to productivity, but we don't necessarily know.
Right. I like the part about making it every week or two, this outcome thing, because one of the first things that I've heard when we started working remotely is that some companies brought certain apps and tech that would tell me exactly what are you doing in terms of clicks of your mouse and activity on the screen. And I was like, what the heck is this? Is the like micromanagement next level, right? So I was like, whoa, this is completely wrong in my opinion. And it sounds like you're absolutely with me. But you also mentioned, how do we bring the tech into the mix to create this connection? So the tech is the solution. We just have to be mindful. It sounds like we have to be mindful what sort of tech and how we apply it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that tools are never the answer, right? Because there's a conversation we need to have about how we're going to work together before we pick those tools. But you're exactly right. It's been maddening watching some companies. The sales of employee monitoring software has exploded, right? I know of one guy that actually recorded, I think this is hilarious, recorded a video of himself doing this, just nodding for 15 minutes, and then would jump on Zoom calls and use that as his virtual background and then leave the room, right? So what would actually happen is he would just play a video on a loop of him nodding in the Zoom calls, right? I know of another person that installed that used their kid's little robotics set and installed a little robot that would move the mouse every couple of minutes. It would just nudge it, right? To keep the computer from falling asleep, which kept the monitoring software running and made it look like that person was working, right? As soon as you start introducing these games, people figure out ways to play around them and to game the system, right?
Yeah.
So we need to have a conversation first about those tools, right? And the monitoring software is almost never the right tool. But besides that, even beyond that, whether it's how active are you in Slack or responsive in email, et cetera, we still need to have a conversation with our team about how do we want to work together in this remote environment? What are appropriate response times? Where are we going to put which information, right? I mean, communication on a team comes in two forms, synchronous and asynchronous. And a lot of problems happen when we start treating tools that were designed to be asynchronous, email, Slack, project management software, as a synchronous tool where we're expecting an almost immediate response. That creates a huge amount of problems. And the problem isn't the tool. The problem is we've never had a conversation about how we as a team are going to use that tool. So that's where we need to start. And then once you do that, you find that, a lot of these monitoring things and ways to spy on the activity of our people, not necessarily track the outcomes. A lot of those are unnecessary.
You spoke about, I know you spoke about building the shared vision. We'll talk about it in a second. But the first thing that came to my mind now, as you were explaining this, measuring this response, how quick we can respond to it. The first thing that came to my mind was that's a massive distractor for me. We know neuroscience is very clear about that. We can't really multitask. Doesn't matter how big your ego is. If you're really in your deep work, if you want to hit that flow state, you can't multitask. So if I got these pings all the time, I'll be distracted and I can't be fully productive. Although I have to admit, first thing that I thought, I was like, I'm quite lonely here. What would happen if I lead a team and actually left that chat open, or have a room where people can just mingle almost as if it would be just a water cooler conversation? But then I've consumed some of your content, and that's not the best strategy, it seems like. I had this idea, I thought it's great, but it seems like I was wrong.
It is and it isn't. It depends on the team, right? I mean, I'm okay with the idea of using Slack or some other chat tool as a kind of running water cooler. The difference is, do your people feel like they have to have it open all the time? Do they feel like, I would advise you to do that, but make a rule as a team that this is not where we discuss projects. This is where we discuss life, right? Because in that way, it's almost like it becomes like the team's Facebook group, right? Where we discuss life, not necessarily work, because then you don't feel like you have to be in it all the time. Then you feel like you can check it anytime you need a brain break. And you created a place just like the water cooler where people are taking breaks and getting a little dose of socialization and then moving away from it to get back and focused on work. Right now, what happens is we start using that tool. It becomes a tool for actually discussing projects, and then you have this place where people feel like they always have to be on. I mean, it's like asking people to work in the middle of a conference room where there's meetings going on all the time and people are speaking in sentence fragments. It's not really ideal for focus, but it can be a great water cooler, right? The difference, again, is we need to have that conversation about boundaries and limits, and we need to say, this is going to be a tool that we're using as our water cooler. So if you want to talk about something work-related, that needs to go in the project management software, or that needs to go in the appropriate email thread or something like that.
Yes, I'll totally agree. And you've mentioned about building this shared vision, and the sense that I get from you so far within this first 12 minutes, the key word here is to really set those boundaries and be clear about what's what for, rather than we're just figuring it out and somehow it will just click and connect, and people will assume that's the way it is and that's the expectations. It seems like it's even more important now to create those boundaries and clarify everything that we do and the purpose of it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, most of the time when I'm working with teams, the very first thing we do, and it ironically solves probably half of the problems just by doing this activity, is we develop a team working agreement, right? We go through and have this conversation. What tools are asynchronous tools and what are synchronous tools? What is an appropriate way to ask for help? What's an appropriate way to give each other feedback? How long is a reasonable amount of time to wait for a reply to an email, for example, before we pick up the phone and call? What hours of the day are off limits for us where we don't want people sending email communication, right? If we take the time to have all of that and put it into like a shared Google Doc, something that's an agreement that everybody can see, right? If we draft that declaration of interdependence, if we will, we're relying on each other and therefore here are our rules. If you have that conversation, you end up solving a lot of other problems that we've been trying to look to tools to solve. It's not about the tools, it's about the norms around those tools.
So from your experience working with those teams, what are the estimates of a reasonable timing of responding to email? Like, what would you say? So if I'm taking over the team and I'm like, right, so I haven't heard it from that person within first half an hour and a half. And we tend to judge the world through our own intention and what I would do and my own needs, and forgetting that there is a whole world happening behind that screen, like in the other end of this country or even the world,
right?
Because I need it now, right? So what would you say is the estimated rough idea that actually, you know what, the reasonable amount is actually that, not this?
Yeah, I mean, so this really depends on the team, and especially if they're, like you were talking about, if they're a geographically dispersed team or if they're all synchronized in the same time zone, right? For a lot of people that were prior to the great work from home experiment were working in an office, they only actually moved 20 miles away max, right? So they're not actually, they're all synchronized in the same time zone, et cetera. And so that it might be a little quicker. For a geographically dispersed team, if you ask most of them, it's usually something like 24 hours, right? And that's fairly reasonable. That's what almost everybody says, but that's not what almost everybody practices, right? Because we all feel that pressure. We feel the pressure to clear out the email inbox before we're done for the day. Well, candidly, the only thing clearing out your email inbox does is ensure that when you wake up the next day, you'll have many more emails in your box, right? Or we'll have the leader who says things like, yeah, 24 hours is a reasonable amount of time, but then he or she will send an email at 10 o'clock at night, his time. And then tomorrow, the first thing on the agenda is an all hands meeting and opens up with, now, did everybody see the email I sent? Well, no, because it's 9 a.m. and most of us are starting our workday. We shouldn't have seen that email yet. So it's one thing to declare as a team, this is what's reasonable. It's a whole other thing to keep each other accountable to that, because we all have these little feelings of micro pressure. Now, that said, I would still always prefer that we come to an agreement on what it is, because that alleviates a lot of the feeling of pressure. Most of our digital distraction, the way that these devices sort of create an always on feeling, most of it, if we're being honest, is self-imposed. It's imposed by the feeling of pressure that we feel to be responsive all the time. And this is something, as a leader, we want to make sure that we're actively working against that feeling, so that people recognize that it's okay to have time away from work. It's okay to have unresponsive time, because we know that time away from work makes work better.
It's as you talk about it now, it's I go back to my own experience. If I, for instance, invite someone to be guest on my show, I can't subconsciously expecting them to see my message within the first few hours and then have the yes or no within the next day. And then for this, snap moment, every now and then I forget it's not about me, it's not about my needs. There's a whole world of happening that I have no idea about. And I'm filtering everything purely through my own expectations and needs. And I think that's where it all goes wrong, when we're not really connecting with other people's needs and reality and their own life, I believe.
Yeah. And some of this is our expectations, and some of it is the medium of communication, right? For a team of people who are working together, these things make phone calls too. We often forget that these you can actually use to have a real-time voice conversation with someone. It's incredible, right? Once we declare as a team that email is an asynchronous tool with a 24-hour response time, then we have to ask, should I send this email? Because if I need an immediate response, I should probably call them. Or maybe we decide that texting each other is okay in the context of work. But again, that has probably a 5 or 6 hour response time as a team, right? These are all things that happen in that team working agreement conversation, because once we set up those response times, it helps people pick that medium of communication based on how quickly of a response they need, right? And if it could wait a couple days, maybe that means we put it in the project management software if we're using one, et cetera, right? But if you don't have that conversation, you end up in exactly the situation you said, sending a 24 to 48 hour response time email and expecting a 2 or 3 hour response. It just doesn't happen more often than not.
Of course. So this building a shared remote vision with your team, I already got the sense of how it should be done. And, are you sharing so much content on the YouTube? It's incredible. And LinkedIn, you can learn from it so much. But could you just walk us through the process of it? Because I'm guessing there are 2 ways of doing so. Some people let's just go through the process, and week by week we'll learn those things and we just improve them and we come back to it and we discuss how it works. But it seems there's a different way that you're suggesting that works a lot more better. What is the process
of coming up with a shared vision, or of coming up with that team working agreement?
Team working agreement. Sorry.
So, I think the process for most team leaders works like this, right? First of all, this is a dedicated meeting. So this is not, we're going to do this quick little activity on the tail end of our weekly all hands meeting. This is, hey, a day or 2 after that, let's call a meeting and let's actually, let's do this. And then it's incumbent on the leader, when that meeting starts, to already have a list of questions they want to ask about communication and collaboration on the team. I have a couple of resources that seed people with some of these questions. Questions like response time is one we've already talked about. How do we want to make requests for help? How do we want to keep each other updated? Now, sometimes you might already be using a project management tool, and so the answer to these questions are provided by the tool, in which case this is a good time to review the tool. But then there's other things in there. How do we want to give each other feedback? Are we welcoming feedback, right? Or do we want to let people ask for it before we give it? This is a good time to ask questions around sharing calendars, right? What are our on times and off times, et cetera? Come with a list of questions and go question by question as a team and have that conversation and have somebody take notes on what the consensus result is. Now, what's going to happen almost every time is that as you are answering those questions, more questions come up. That's okay. Just move to the bottom, right? I really recommend working in a shared document, either a shared whiteboard or a Google Doc or something that everybody can see in real time, and have someone update. And anytime there's a new question, just add it to the list at the bottom and keep that meeting going until we as a team have come up with answers to all of those questions, right? So now we have all of those. And I think what makes it really fun to me is you turn the answers to those questions into declarative statements. We agree that 24 hours is a reasonable response time, right? Or we agree that when somebody presents a project, we should ask something like, I have a friend who always asks the question, are you looking for feedback or are you looking for applause, right? Before he offers any constructive criticism. And I love that, right? I mean, I kind of hate that he always associates feedback with constructive criticism, but his point is he makes a point to check in every time and go, well, what, you made this announcement about completing this deliverable. What do you want out of it? Do you want feedback or do you just want like, great job, right? So little things like that become these declarative statements. We agree to use Slack as a communication tool for non-work discussions, right? All of those turn into a series of agreements. We check in and make sure we've got consensus on all of those agreements, and then we lock that document. That is our team working agreement. And it's something that we hold each other accountable to. When somebody is out of line based on the norms that we just created as a document, we can reference back to it. It also makes a great onboarding document, right? Imagine joining a new team and having them hand you like, here's the owner's manual for us, right? Here's how we work as a team. You could even use it. I mean, some teams don't even save it for onboarding. They use it in the interview process. This is how we work together. Does this work for you? Because if it doesn't, then, even if you're a great candidate, you might be better off on a different team, right? So you start with those questions, you turn the answers to those questions into declarative statements. And once everybody sort of agrees, you lock that document, at least for a time, right? And then you create it, maybe check in every 6 months, every year, you see, are we still abiding by those norms, or have we learned things? Have people changed? And so we need to change those norms, et cetera. So it's a living document for sure, but you do want it to be sort of like a constitution for a country. You only want it changed every once in a while, not all of the time.
So we don't get lost. We don't get lost in terms of, well, we agreed last time this, now we're doing all of a sudden differently. I'm still, in my mind, we're still operating in that sort of time frame, and now it's different. But I really like the idea of bringing this document into the interview process, because if I would be that person who applies for you, for me personally, the two things I'll be looking for. Number one, I would be looking at what is that working for me? Am I resonating with you? And number two, what's the passive feedback of it? Like, how much do you really trust people? How much what sort of those processes are aligned with your values that you have on your wall? And how many of them are against sort of things? So that's what I would be looking for if I am on that kind of candidate seat. But for you as a manager, as a leader, if you do that, please be mindful, I believe, because they have to resonate. They have to match. You can't just say, hey, we trust people, and then the shared agreement is forced and it all says micromanagement sort of thing.
Exactly.
You mentioned about feedback, and it would be really bad on me if I wouldn't explore that topic a little bit more, because it's all new. For me, one of the biggest challenge with the feedback, two challenges are context or lack of it, and really behavioral cues. Like, I can really sense the emotional, the context behind it, the intonation behind it, whether it's your behavior or the feedback remotely is slightly behind the mist. It's not as clear anymore for me. I feel really good when I can look into your eyes and have a conversation and sense your intention. Intention is here. It's huge. If you start sharing feedback through messages and everything, I will write my own intention and context towards it. Right? So what are the best practices that you've seen around sharing feedback and the processes behind it?
Yeah. I mean, so before we get into processes and that sort of thing, we should probably talk about medium, right? And this is one, you mentioned this a bit with, in person, I can pick up on a lot more and I can sense a lot more cues and context than I can virtually. Ironically, we live in this time. And I think personally, half of the reason that the great work from home experiment started as a response to the pandemic is that we felt like we could, right? We felt like we had the technology to send everyone home. If this were 30 years ago, when we didn't have the technology, we'd be looking for other ways to slow the spread because it wasn't feasible, right? So now it's feasible. The interesting thing, though, is that as we probably learned over the last year, the technology, it's not as great as when we started, right? Zoom fatigue is a very real thing. It's not as open and free flowing. I mean, a creative thinking or a brainstorming session is a great example. It just doesn't work as well, right? But feedback is another one. And believe it or not, when you can't be in the room, there's a good amount of research that suggests that an audio only call is better for emotional empathy than a video call, right? So this is super counterintuitive because we think we want to read the nonverbals, et cetera, but we're actually better. And this is based on the research of a brilliant researcher named Michael Krauss. We're actually better at sensing the emotions in the other person when we're deprived of those visual cues because we have to listen in a whole lot harder. So that would be my first piece of advice, right? It shouldn't be a text-based medium at all for the problems that you recommended. People read their own intonation into it and that sort of thing. But it may not be that a video call is the best medium for it. It may be that an audio-only sort of phone call is the best medium for that. So that's one on the medium. In terms of feedback in general, I mean, I'm the biggest fan of first of all, of appreciative inquiry. So I actually prefer most of the feedback to be positive, and connecting the positive behaviors people had to the way it serves the larger team so that they're more likely to repeat those positive behaviors. But even when it has to be constructive or corrective, I'm a big fan of the sort of, I stole it from Pixar, but what they call plussing, right? This idea of giving somebody a criticism, but adding a plus, meaning a suggestion for how they can improve upon it. Now, what plussing does is this isn't micromanagement. This isn't you sucked here, so now you need to do it this way. This is, I noticed you struggled in this capacity. What if we did this to build upon that? And because you're saying it as a what if we, you're also forfeiting the right to check in on whether or not they chose that piece of advice, right? So when you're the idea behind plussing is you're always trying to build upon the ideas of others. And even when you're offering a constructive thing, it's still your responsibility to try and build on it. But the ultimate person, this is true for making a hit movie like The Incredibles, and it's true for us as individuals. The ultimate agency for changing behavior always rests with the individual. So the best thing you can do is make suggestions for them that give them options to improve upon it, but you don't have a right to tell them how you want them to do things, right? I mean, you can try that, but you are going to end up micromanaging them, making them more miserable and more likely to leave. It's not actually going to work because anything that deprives people of their agency or their sense of autonomy is going to decrease their motivation. You're going to do more damage in the long term. So I'm totally okay with constructive criticism, but add that plus and then recognize that what you're doing is not telling them you have to behave differently. What you're doing is offering them a way to remedy the potentially negative thing that you noticed, but you're still giving them agency to change that behavior.
Oh, I like the idea of plussing, the sound of it and how it's phrased, because I haven't heard it before, although intuitively to me, it always made sense. I always drove back into my experience as an athlete in the working sport. And when I transitioned into an employment, I was confused with the relationship that we have with feedback. One of the first things that I realized, David, is exactly what you said. Feedback for an athlete is offered paired with, this is how you improve it, right? So there's always feedback. Literally for me, feedback is a jump starter to supporting someone, to help. It's a jump starter. So there has to be some continuous here. Whatever shape or form that is, it has to be there. And the intention needs to be very clear. And in the working environment, it often is feedback is just feedback. I'm saying what I'm saying because I'm the manager and this is how you need to improve. Something that you've mentioned is also something that really is there and exists. And what it creates, you just mentioned, lack of autonomy. And it's not intrinsically driven because I will only do things for you when I really, really respect you, like mentor-like to me. But if you continuously saying, hey, I'm your manager, this is how you do that,
right,
you're not going to build that relationship with me. And if you phrase the feedback, this is how you do it, then I will quite frankly rebel against it. And right at the beginning, you've mentioned something interesting. If companies trying to game employees, they will retaliate back. Sometimes it's not directly, but they will just come up with an idea how to move the mouse, right? If you tell me how to do things with the feedback, then I'll just nod my head, but I'll find a different ways of not complying with you and not doing things for you, in fact, against you. So I like the idea of the plussing. It's really important. But the audio part, it's fascinating. I mean, this is already, wow, huge for me. I gotta check this out because I'm stunned.
This was the most surprising thing I found in doing the research for Leading From Anywhere was all of this research about audio and emotional empathy and that sort of thing. And the only explanation that's really offered by the research is that idea that deprived of all of these other nonverbals, we still have to lean into tone of voice and things like that, as emotional cues. You know, I think to build on that with a technology like Zoom, because most of the experiments were actually done comparing an in-person conversation to an in-person conversation separated by a partition or in a dark room or something like that, right? So I mean, that was actually the most high fidelity version of a conversation you could have versus audio. Now, to think that a Zoom call, I mean, I'm sure I did this to you. You've glitched out on me 2 or 3 times as we struggle against the bandwidth gods on a Friday afternoon, right? So imagine a high stakes conversation between a leader and somebody on the team where you're trying to rely on facial expressions and all of that sort of stuff. Zoom is glitching out and pausing and things like that, right? That's almost harder than having a phone conversation instead, right? Where you're consuming less bandwidth, so you're actually having a higher fidelity conversation because you've given up on the verbal cues, but that's fine because you didn't really have the technology to notice them altogether. Now, all of that assumes that the employee hasn't just recorded a video of themselves nodding the whole time, which is also how people tend to use these tools.
This is hilarious, like genuinely. I'm not surprised though. I'm not surprised. People just coming up with so many different ways and things that but that made me really smile. I was actually about to ask you what was the most surprising thing that you found as you were researching it. You just literally shared that with me. And
sorry, I jumped the gun there. I apologize.
No, not at all. It's something that wow, it's going to stuck in my head now, and I'll be thinking about it. When you've mentioned about it, David, I kind of imagine myself, if I listen to the voice message and the feedback, I would use my imagination more and I would just create that as well with it. And as you mentioned, you have to really listen rather than just watch and think. And if somebody isn't the most extroverted person and is not really mastered this art of aligning your body language with your tonality and with the message, then we will pay attention to what we see more than to the words itself. In that context, that's the Mahragan rule. But it's not everyone's trend. Not everyone has. It's actually interesting part. Not everyone has the quality camera for me to really read that micro expression. And I would be, if I'm on the receiving end, 100%. I really would watch you and read it because that's just who I am. If I know I don't have it, that's okay because it's not there. If I could have it and it's just something goes against me, it distracts me completely, and the whole message is now being lost.
Yeah, no, exactly. And it's even little things, like even if you've got a good quality, right? Like, I'll give you an example. We're 37 minutes into chatting together. I've been staring at my camera lens most of the time. You're actually over here. Right? If I were trying to look at your face, how engaged do I look at you right now, right? I can see your emotions now, but I look disconnected from you. And that's actually because I have this whole camera and microphone set up over here. But the same thing happens on a normal webcam computer. If I'm looking, do you sense that I'm not actually looking at you, right? Because I'm looking at where your face should be on a computer, or maybe it's down below the camera on a computer. I'm not actually looking at you, right? So I've had to learn over time through, media training and stuff like that to stare straight at the lens if I want to look like I'm engaged with you. Your average manager doesn't know stuff like that, right? So she's looking at you, trying to gauge the facial expressions. You're staring at her forehead, thinking, wow, my boss doesn't care, right? Right? And it's it's just the technology piece, right?
And very quickly in the real time, we can't really connect it because it's already feedback conversation. The emotions are higher already. We are as cognitive about it and aware. And if you just bring it all together, this is brilliant advice. I love it. I absolutely love it, David. So here's the next question. So we are a year into this. Let's just stick with an extra 15 days, extra 20 days, and it's a year later. Is the remote working staying with us permanently, or is it going to shape and change? And what's really going to happen? I know we don't have a definite answer. What's your feeling around it?
Yeah. So, I mean, maybe this was surprising finding too, right? But the truth is, so just before, here in the United States, just before the pandemic really hit our shores in early February, of every year, Gallup releases their State of the American Workplace Survey. And it's basically the results of all of their work judging employee engagement and things like that over a year. And they had a line in there that got a lot of attention post-pandemic, but normally gets ignored. And the line was that they broke down engagement scores by percent of time people reported being at the office. And the most engaged employees were the ones that spent 40% to 60% of their time not in the office. Not 100%. That actually had the same level of engagement as people who spent 0%, right? It was a sort of bell curve, and the sweet spot seemed to be 40 to 60%. So I look at that, and that was before a pandemic sort of forced our hand. And I think my best bet, if I had to guess where we're going when it's safe to come back to the office, and by the way, it's going to be safe for different people at different times, right? So this is not a let's all come back type of thing.
Yeah.
This is a long-term process. But even then, I think a lot of people like the flexibility they've been forced to get used to over the last year, and I don't see them giving it up. I see them fighting for a new status quo where they get between 40 and 60% of the time. So I think most organizations and most team leaders should be counting on seeing your people 2 to 3 days a week and seeing a different set of people, a different set of days a week. I say it in the book. Pretty much every leader needs to think of himself or herself as the leader of a remote team, because the likelihood that your entire team is going to be around you all of the time is very, very slim. There will be times where they're all around you again, right? When it's safe to gather again, but it won't be as often as it was before. Because people are going to leverage what we've all lived through to get to that sweet spot of 40 to 60%, or maybe it's 25 to 50% of their time away from the office. So we're going to see a level of workplace flexibility that we've never seen before. And frankly, that's a good thing, right? We were already sort of heading there. We just we did. I mean, I saw a stat the other day that we had 10 years of technological advancement in 1 year because we had to adapt. I think the same is probably true for workplace policies and practices in regards to flexibility. The pandemic forced us to make a 10-year leap towards a greater, more flexible workplace.
It's incredible what humanity can do when we have to and we have no choice. Until then, it's but what if, maybe later, maybe this. Well, you have no choice. We got to come up, and magic happens. When I was thinking about that question, are we going to come back, or what will be the ratio? So I always think about what Simon Sinek talks about: video vloggers and YouTubers. They still meet in real life because it's needed. There is a magic. We are human beings. You can't just completely disregard hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, right? You can't subsidize that. So I'm wondering how it will be. And my good feeling is also that there's going to be a certain a ratio and level. Which brings me to the next question. We're hearing different companies, especially the big names, they've been quoted that post-pandemic, they allow everyone to stay at home. And I'm wondering, is it wise to really make that commitment right now? Or there are some, maybe you know more than I, maybe there are some nuances that say, hey, it will be possible, but that sort of thing. Because when I read just note like that, I think it's a little bit premature because we don't know what's going to happen, and we don't know the real impact of not being face-to-face for such a prolonged time in a longer scale. So what are your thoughts? Is it a little bit premature, or is it the right thing to do and say it outright?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on the company here and the announcement they've made, right? So some have said, yeah, we're remote first, right? Meaning we're going to close up and cancel office space, sell off or try and get out of leases and all of that sort of thing, and we'll just use temporary facilities for company meetings and that sort of thing. I think that's probably a little premature. But I do think every company, rather than dangle people in limbo of when they don't know when they'll be back to the office, I think every company should be saying, we are going to give people a whole lot more flexibility. We're going to give power to you to decide where you work from, right? You tell us. And I think most companies need to be doing that. I would call that sort of, if the other is sort of remote first, let's call this remote friendly, et cetera. I think the optimal thing to be doing right now for every organization and for every leader is not trying to answer the question, when do people get back to the office? Because they're not coming back, at least not all of them and not all of the time. The question should be, how do we create an office where everyone feels welcome, but no one feels obligated, right? Yeah. Before the pandemic, there were two different ways that companies became remote, right? The first is that they decided almost from the beginning that we're going to be a fully distributed company. That's really hard for a 10,000, 20,000 person multinational company to do. If you've been around for 50 years, you can't just decide that magically. But the other path is that what tends to happen is larger organizations decide, they commit to the idea that we're going to give our people more trust and autonomy than we have before, including the autonomy to decide where they're going to work. and they become almost remote by default. Their people end up showing up at the office between 20 and 50% of the time. Right. So that's where I think most companies should be planning on is we're going to re-engineer the office that we have to be much more about creating meeting places and collaboration places and places for people who, quite frankly, don't want to work from home to feel like they're welcome. But we are going to focus on creating a place where no one feels obligated because, I mean, I just think it was maddening even before the pandemic. How many times you end up in that situation where it's 4:15, you've done everything you can do that day. If you started a new project, you'd be there till 6. So you just hang out and do nothing until 5 because that's the culturally accepted idea of when you're supposed to leave, right? That level of ridiculousness is gone, or at least it should be gone. And for companies that are really trying to attract and retain talent, it's gone, right? So that should be the focus. Remote, I actually don't. This is the irony, right? The subtitle of the book is it's about managing remote teams, but the title of the book is Leading from Anywhere, because I think the future that most companies should be planning on is working from anywhere. From anywhere means the office. It means from home. It means potentially at a co-working space if you'd rather go there to a third place. It has dramatic effects on things like vacation policies, right? Because we may have the ability to spend 3 weeks working from somewhere else while we're actually on a family vacation, but we're checking in and we're getting our work done. Like there's a bunch that goes into this idea of working from anywhere, and that's what we ought to be planning for now.
So and it goes right back to the point of looking after the outcomes. If I'm leading and coaching and developing my team of 10, and that's what majority of my time I'm spending on, if I can do it with my family whilst I'm having holiday and I'm still getting the best out of my team and they're the most productive, the most engaged, then why wouldn't we, right?
Exactly.
So there is this last question that I always love to ask my guests, and I'm so curious about it, David. Who is the best coach-like leader that you worked with or for?
Yeah. So, I thought about this in the context of worked for. I could probably name a different one in terms of worked with as a client or something like that. But early on in my career, ironically, I started my career in a remote organization, but we didn't call it that. We just called it outside sales because pretty much everybody who worked for, a national level sales organization didn't work out of an office. You worked out of your home. And I got really lucky, actually. I was spoiled. My first boss ever was a coach, and a coach in the sense that he was willing to be very vulnerable as well. I mean, the practice of of teaching leaders to be coaches involves submitting to the idea that this is a two-way street. This isn't just about providing you feedback. This is about taking feedback as well. And that requires a level of vulnerability. And as we know, as I would later learn, because I quit that job and went back to grad school, as I would later learn, trust is a reciprocal thing, right? You display vulnerability, and the process of doing that makes people feel trusted. And that makes it more likely for them to respond in kind. And then you develop a relationship where you really can give positive, negative, or all sorts of performance feedback. But the best leaders, the most coaching leaders go first, and they're willing to be vulnerable. And I was super lucky that my first job out of school, out of university ever, I got to witness one of those. I didn't fully appreciate it until he left and went to another organization, and I got a not as good boss. But I ended up quitting like 9 months later and going back to grad school anyway. So and in grad school, learning just how smart that guy was, despite having not studied organizational psychology ever.
Yes, you were really lucky, because sometimes you just have to wait years. I know I had to wait years for my first coach-like leader who completely changed my life. And as a matter of the fact, I've launched this podcast because I know there are loads of leaders, managers out there who have that passion and desire to change the world, but they're not fortunate to have that person to the right and left that will just support them. And then eventually they just withdraw into the bad habits, because that's just the way it's done here. So that's how I imagine myself with every single episode, with every single guest that I'm inviting, that if I was back as that manager, the junior manager, and I didn't have that support and I had to remotely lead my team, what would I do? Who can help me with it? And you have shed so much light on the questions that I had trying to come up with for myself. And the feedback one is incredible one. Thank you very much, David. I really appreciate you for taking your time out of your busy schedule and have this conversation with me.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Awesome, guys. So that's about it. This episode also will be launched in a few weeks as a podcast. Until then, have a good day on purpose.